Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today because we have the pleasure to welcome Mark Schiefsky on behalf of all of us at the Center for Hellenic Studies in Greece. It is wonderful to have you, Mark. Mark Schiefsky is the C. Lois P. Grove Professor of the Classics and Director of Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies in Washington, D.C. He is a historian of philosophy and science in the ancient world. Much of his work is concerned with the ways in which philosophy interacted with science in Greco-Roman antiquity, how philosophical theories shaped and were shaped by scientific inquiry in various domains, including medicine, mechanics, mathematics, and astronomy. His 2005 book entitled Hippocrates on Ancient Medicine, translated with introduction and commentary, studies these themes in the case of one of the most important and influential texts of the Hippocratic corpus on ancient medicine. This book also reflects his long-standing interest in the concept of techne, art, or expertise, which informs and motivates much of his work on philosophical and scientific texts. He is interested both in what philosophers like Plato and Aristotle said techne is, and in what practitioners of the various disciplines took it to be. In recent years, Schiefsky has been working on the reception of ancient Greek philosophy and science, particularly in the Arabic-speaking world, but also in the Renaissance. See his paper, Art and Nature in Ancient Mechanics. Similarly, the Greco-Arabic translation movement of the 8th to 10th centuries CE, as well as being crucial for the transmission of ancient Greek texts, is a highly significant phase in the reception of Greek culture that can reveal a great deal about the meaning of a text, such as Aristotle's Poetics. A third area in which Schiefsky works is digital humanities, where he has focused both on creating structured digital corpora and on developing software to apply techniques from natural language processing to the study of texts in a variety of languages. He pursued these efforts in the context of two major sponsored research projects, the Archimedes Project from 2001 to 2004, which was funded by the National Science Foundation and concerned with the history of mechanics, and a separate project funded by the Mellon Foundation in 2010-13, which resulted in the creation of a digital corpus of Greek and Arabic texts connected with the translation movement. Schiefsky contributed to the creation of Arboreal, a software application that enables the extraction and visualization of semantic networks from textual corpora in a variety of languages. See his 2015 paper, Beyond Archimedes. Today, he will be talking to us about democracy, liberty, and expertise in ancient Greece. Dear Mark, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Anna. I'm very grateful for that kind and generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to see so many people in attendance, and a special welcome to the students who are in Greece and are with us today. I hope to be able to address some things that may be of interest to you as you begin your studies of ancient political philosophy in particular. So my topic is democracy, liberty, and expertise in ancient Greece. And I'm really concerned with one big question here, which is what can we learn, if anything, from the experience of ancient Athenian democracy that can help us address contemporary challenges? Questions like this that attempt to apply an understanding of antiquity to contemporary challenges have always been at the core of the mission of the Center for Hellenic Studies since its foundation in the 1960s. And I think it should be clear to all of us that these questions are more urgent than ever today. when the fight against authoritarianism is very much a live issue, both between states, as we see in Ukraine, and within states, like my country, the United States. So here is yesterday's New York Times, which I think makes the point succinctly and clearly. Enraged Trump encouraged violence and sought to join mob, aide testified. When I saw that, I felt like I was replaying the history of Pisistratus or something in the 6th century back in ancient Athens. So we face urgent challenges about how democracy, modern democracy, can survive and maintain its vitality. And it's appropriate to turn back to the ancients and reflect on what they have to tell us. So I want to make 3 sets of remarks. One of them is focused on democracy and what we mean by democracy when we talk about ancient Athens and contemporary Western democracies. Secondly, I want to talk about the idea of liberty, which is a very important part of the ideology of democracy, both in antiquity and today. And then third, I want to talk about expertise, specialized knowledge, and the place that this has in ancient democracy, and reflect a little bit about on what that might tell us for today. So first democracy, then liberty, and then expertise. So I'll begin with the topic of democracy. Now, of course, the modern word democracy goes back to the ancient Greek word demokratia. But is it even appropriate to call ancient Athens a democracy as the term is understood today? The word demokratia means people power, one succinct way to summarize it. And of course, there is a certain amount of people power in modern democracies, but in a sense, ancient Athens was too democratic for modern tastes. There was an extraordinary level of people power in ancient Athens, much more than we have in contemporary Western democracies. And I might just mention some of the key features. The Athenians decided on political questions in the assembly rather than having elected representatives do so. They decided legal issues in the courts. There were not specialized judges who had the power over the legal system. So law was very much a part of politics in ancient Athens in a way that it is not today. And ancient Athenians participated in holding office, generally chosen by lottery rather than by election. So there was an extraordinary level of political participation in ancient Athenian democracy in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. A level which greatly exceeds the experience of contemporary American society, at least, where typically civic participation, I think, is limited to voting and participation on juries. Although normally, if you get selected for a jury in the United States, you will, at least I am never actually a final member of the jury. You go through a process. You're selected by lot, but generally you're cast aside. You're not actually involved. You're rejected for whatever reason. They tend to not like Harvard faculty on juries for perhaps obvious reasons. You know, one doesn't have that opportunity. But the ancient Athenians certainly did have ample opportunities. So that's one big difference, the direct democratic participation that we had in ancient Athens. But of course, in another sense, ancient Athens was not really democratic enough. You might even wonder, should we call it a democracy, since civic participation was highly restricted, indeed restricted to adult male citizens. It was only the adult males who could participate politically in all of these ways. And if one thinks about the numbers, the population of ancient Attica was maybe 300,000 people. How many adult male citizens were there? Maybe 50,000. So we have government of essentially 300,000 people in control of 50,000 people. How many people actually could go to the Athenian assembly at one time? Maybe 5,000. Of course, there were many meetings of the assembly. It wasn't always the same people going to the assembly. Nonetheless, in practice, you had decisions being made by a minority of the actual population, with women, slaves, resident aliens being excluded from politics. So should we really call that a democracy at all when it is so exclusive? And nowadays, we would not accept such exclusions in contemporary democracies. So there are these problems of comparing ancient and modern democracy based on these differences which pull in two different directions. I think the comparison is valid, the comparison is helpful. There's a clear sense in which modern democracy is the descendant of ancient democratia. And we can see that if we think about the ideology of democracy and democratia, which is indeed quite shared between the ancient and modern, at least in the main. Both the Athenian democratic tradition and modern liberal democracies are committed to values such as liberty, equality, the rule of law, equal representation before the law for people at any level of society. And these values can be found across the corpus of Athenian texts from the 5th and 4th centuries, and of course are fundamental to documents like the American Constitution and other comparable texts. So the shared ideology is the link, I think, that enables us to see these as closely related systems that have productive comparison with each other. There's also the idea of self-government, because of course, democracy is a system in which, in principle, everybody, that is to say, all those who are considered qualified to participate for whatever reason, everybody participates in governing the community. And if you contrast that with other forms of government, they are certainly not self-government. In the ancient sense, we have monarchy, we have oligarchy, rule by a few or rule by one as forms of government that are discussed in ancient Greek texts. And those are not systems of self-government. Not everybody there is participating in the governance of the community. And fundamental to this idea of both ancient and modern democracy is the idea that government is of the people, right? The entire people are involved. Finally, I would just say that, of course, the principles and the ideology of democracy was quite limited in its scope in ancient Athens. On the one hand, it was limited because women, slaves, foreigners were not included in the democratic project. On the other hand, of course, it was much more inclusive than other kinds of government in the ancient Greek world. So from that point of view, because it included people at all economic levels of society, it really stood apart from other forms of government. So any adult male could participate in the democratic system, regardless of how much property they had. That was really the defining criterion. That's what Aristotle says in the Politics, and I think that that's correct. People at all levels of the economic spectrum could participate in government. So even if the principles were limited, they were still radical in the context. And the ideas of democracy, the idea that there is equality, liberty, respect for rule of law, these ideas proved indeed very powerful over time. and indeed capable of legitimating the extension of participation, as we see from the history of the United States since its inception. We abolished slavery, we extended political participation to women and so forth on the basis of these democratic ideals. So the ideology is, I think, extremely important when we focus on this comparison. And I think we can, by focusing on that, we can learn from both the similarities between ancient and modern democracy and from the differences. Particularly the differences can be revealing, and they may teach us something about what we need to do to improve our democratic project today. So those are my remarks on democracy in general. And now I want to turn to the second of my three topics, which is the topic of liberty, a core democratic value of ancient democracy. And I want to talk a little bit about what they meant by liberty, how they understood the concept of liberty, and whether it was different from the way liberty is understood today. Because, of course, liberty is a fundamental term in modern democratic thinking as well. Now, liberty is the English word that I'm using to translate eleutheria. This is the Greek that underlies that word. And I'm not going to distinguish between liberty and freedom. Freedom is also a possible translation of eleutheria. So when I talk about liberty or freedom, I really mean eleutheria as we find it in the ancient text. We could think about whether there is a relevant distinction between liberty and freedom, but I'm not going to go into that in my remarks. Now, I want to begin this part of my talk with a passage from Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle's Politics is a wonderfully revealing and deep analysis of the different forms of government in the Greek world of the 4th century BCE, particularly democracy. Aristotle, of course, was no Democrat. He didn't like democracy as such. He tends to view democracy not as rule by all for the common good, but rule by one faction, namely the demos, the common people, the lower classes in their own interests. This is one understanding of democracy that one finds in essentially those who were opposed to democracy in the ancient text. But in any case, Aristotle, in one passage of the Politics, says something quite significant about democratic political theory. This is Politics, Book 6, Chapter 2, 1317a in the Becker edition. And this is what Aristotle says. Quote, a basic principle of the democratic constitution is liberty, eleutheria. People constantly make this statement, implying that only in this constitution do men share in liberty. For every democracy, they say, has liberty as its aim. Every democracy, they say, has liberty as its aim. So this is a rather precious passage because we don't actually have much positive democratic theorizing from Athenian writers. And here Aristotle is giving us a window onto what democratic theorists said. What did they promise people if they were to submit to the democratic project? Well, what they promised them was liberty, and only in a democracy, they said, could one attain true liberty. So what did it mean, in short? What did it mean to be free in ancient Athens? What did it mean to be eleutheros for an ancient Athenian who subscribed to the democratic project, the kind of person that Aristotle is talking about here? And I want to suggest that there are 4 features of this concept that are worth reflecting on, and I'll list them now and then go through them a little bit more methodically. So the 4 features of liberty in ancient Athenian democracy, I think, are first, not being a slave. To be free meant you were not a slave. To be free also meant you were not ruled by tyrants. That's the second one. Third, to be free meant that you were able to participate in politics, in political decision-making in all the ways that I already mentioned, in the assembly, in the courts, and so on and so forth, by holding office in regular rotation. So third is the ability to participate in political decision-making. And fourth is the ability to live as you like. That is a slogan that Aristotle, in fact, gives us from the democratic theorists. He says a mark of liberty is the ability to live freely, to live in the way that you like, free of external constraints. So these are the four marks of liberty, and I want to go through a little bit more closely now. And the first one is not being a slave. Of course, the Athenians who were free lived and worked in close proximity to slaves. It was a slave society. Slaves permeated Athenian society. So everybody who was free in Athenian society was very well aware of the fact that they were not a slave. The number of slaves in ancient Athens was surely larger than the number of adult male citizens. So if there are 50,000 adult male citizens, maybe there are 50 to 80 to 100,000 slaves. Of course, the estimates are quite uncertain, but I follow the lead of historians like Paul Cartledge in these kinds of numbers. That just gives us a framework. There are more slaves than free people. If you're free, you're going to be well aware of that fact in ancient Athens. So freedom meant, in the first place, not being a slave. Secondly, freedom meant not being ruled by tyrants. This is a fundamental principle of the Athenian democratic ideology. The origin stories of the Athenian democracy go back to expelling the tyrants, Pisistratus in particular, or the sons of Pisistratus. The tyrannicides, Harmodius and Aristogeiton, as described by Thucydides, are held in awe and veneration by the Athenians, as Thucydides laments, by the Athenians of the late 5th century as being the ones who brought liberty and freed the Athenians from the evils of tyranny. And indeed, even near the very end of Athenian democracy, we find an obsession, a concern with avoiding tyranny. In the law of Eucrates, which was actually circulated on the image for my talk, this is a law against tyranny that was proposed and ratified in 336 BCE by one Eucrates, showing that even at that very late time when the Macedonian domination really loomed, the Athenians were still concerned with this notion that they are not ruled by tyrants, that they not be ruled by single rulers with arbitrary power who are not accountable to the populace. These are the characteristics of tyrannical rule in Athenian texts. So to be free meant you were not living under a tyranny. Tyranny was typically seen as a form of enslavement in Athenian texts. You see that in Herodotus, other writers. So those first two criteria of freedom go together, not being a slave and not being ruled by tyrants. Now, these two are clearly not enough to make you really free if you're a Greek democrat. After all, anybody living in an oligarchy where the rule was conducted by the rich, those with more property, anybody living in that kind of society who was free, was not a slave, was also not being ruled by a tyrant. Oligarchies were not tyrannies, and indeed tyranny had pretty much disappeared from the picture by the time we get to the 5th and 4th centuries, at least in the main. So when Aristotle is talking about the different kinds of constitution and government, he mainly talks about oligarchy versus democracy. So it was not enough just to be not a slave, just to be not ruled by a tyrant, to have democratic liberty. Democratic liberty meant something much more than those two negative criteria. And of course, we have to add then the positive liberty, the ability to participate in political decision making. This was crucial to the claims of the Democrats. You had to be able to participate quite extensively in political decision making. And of course, there was a debate about how extensive. Aristotle tells us there are 4 different kinds of democracy, and he ranks them based on the extensiveness or lack thereof of participation by the lower classes. So nonetheless, the core of the idea is that everybody can participate in political decision-making. And in that same passage of Aristotle's Politics, book 6, chapter 2, which definitely repays close study, we find this idea captured by Aristotle in the phrase ruling and being ruled in turn. This is what you get in a democracy if you are a citizen. You rule sometimes, you hold office, you sit on a jury, you make a decision in the assembly, but you're also ruled in turn because offices rotate, you rotate off juries. Maybe somebody else goes to the assembly, you can't make it because the crops are coming in on your farm in Attica or something. But part of the democratic experience, the key part of it, is ruling and being ruled in turn. So that's the third crucial aspect of democratic liberty. And then finally, what Aristotle gives us again in that same passage as the other part of ancient liberty in the democracy was living as you like. That's the 4th of my criteria. And that's the exact phrase that Aristotle uses. So evidently the slogan that the democratic theorists use, you can live as you like, pursue whatever projects you want to pursue. You will not be disturbed by others, by the state, and so forth, at least to a large extent. So this notion of free living, of course, is viewed very negatively by the elitist philosophers. Aristotle thinks that this leads to a kind of laziness. Everybody, he says at one point in the Politics, he says everybody wants to live as they like, not as they should. And Plato, of course, in his critique of democracy in the Republic, is quite exercised by the fact that democracy involves this kind of freedom, the freedom to set your own agenda, the freedom to pursue whatever projects you want to pursue. So this is the final key aspect. And points 3 and 4 here are obviously crucial to the democratic kind of liberty. 1 and 2 are common features of freedom that one finds in most, if not all, of the Greek city-states of the 5th and 4th century. Now, I want to comment then, turning really to the question of comparing this with modern conceptions of liberty. I want to comment on these from that point of view. And of course, in modern political philosophy, it's become somewhat standard following Isaiah Berlin, the great political philosopher, to distinguish between negative liberty and what he calls positive liberty. Negative liberty being freedom from some sort of constraint, the ability to be free of impediments in setting one's life projects or acting, versus positive liberty, which Berlin formulates as freedom to do things. the positive ability to engage in certain activities, to have certain privileges, indeed to get certain things from the state. And Berlin is very worried about what happens when there's a focus on positive liberty at the expense of negative liberty. How can the state, in fact, threaten the freedom of individuals to do what they like? That was one of the things that really motivated Berlin in drawing this distinction. Now, if you think about my list from this perspective, numbers 1 and 2, not being a slave and not being ruled by tyrants, those are clearly negative liberties, freedom from constraint. Number 3, the ability to participate in politics, in political decision making, is a positive liberty, something that a citizen is able to do, that is not just freedom from constraint, but something that they really can engage in, specifically certain political acts. And then finally is number 4, the ability to live as you like. So what do we say really about the relationship between 3, political participation, and 4, living as you like? That's really the crucial issue when we compare ancient and modern conceptions of liberty. Now, we can take the ability to live as you like as a kind of negative liberty in Berlin's sense. The idea that one can live exactly as one likes without any external constraints. And that suggests a democratic bargain that runs something like this. So again, we take number 3, ruling and being ruled in turn, and put it with number 4, living as you like, and we get this: better not to be ruled by anyone, better to be free of ever being ruled by anyone else, but at least in a democracy, I also have a chance to participate in ruling. I can rule over others sometimes, and I can otherwise live freely. So I should submit to democracy because I do at least have a chance to rule sometimes, and I will be able to live more or less as I like. Nonetheless, it would be better not to be ruled at all. This is a view that Aristotle gives us in that passage, again, Politics 6, chapter 2, as the argument of some democratic theorists. So on that view, political participation, ruling and being ruled, is a kind of burden that you put up with so that you can attain personal freedom. I will submit to all the laborious tasks of participating in politics so that I can live my life as I like without interference. This is one version of the ancient democratic bargain that I think we can plausibly reconstruct from these texts. But there's also another version that we find in the ancient tradition. And this, I think, is one that has some very interesting implications. The other way of reconciling numbers 3 and 4 on my list is to say that participation in politics, rather than being a burden, is actually what enables you to live as you like. It enables you to develop your human capacities to live a life of freedom, to engage in projects, to earn money if that's what you want to do, to pursue wisdom if that's what you want to do. The idea that political participation and personal freedom are not opposed, but interdependent. They contribute to each other. Personal liberty contributes to political participation and vice versa. So rather than seeing the individual and the state as potentially in conflict, as the modern liberal theorists tend to do, The ancient Athenian democratic perspective, I think, tends to see them as working together as interdependent. And I think that's an interesting point of view that merits careful reflection. This is essentially democracy before liberalism, democracy at a time when the question of state coercion on the individual had not become the central issue of political theory. And I think you can see that from many Athenian texts. You can see that in the funeral oration of Pericles, which emphasizes the harmony between public and private life, the respect for individual talents, the fostering of individual talents by the state, regardless of one's social position. So this kind of positive reinforcement between the individual and the institutions of the polis is fundamental to that ideal. And I would also say that that's fundamental to Aristotle's take on these matters. Although again, Aristotle was no democrat as such, nonetheless, recall that Aristotle argues that the state, the polis, is natural. It is not something that is imposed as a hindrance on human development. It is rather the end or fulfillment of human, part of human nature. Man, as Aristotle says at the very beginning of the Politics, is a political animal, politikon zoon, meaning that humans can only attain their full potential if they live in, well, a polis, Aristotle would say, or let us say a state. Only when they associate with others in this kind of community can we as individuals attain our full potential. The ability of humans to flourish depends on this kind of civic participation. However, we define civic participation, and Aristotle would have his own ideas about that and about who gets to participate. But nonetheless, the basic concept that we can only attain our true fulfillment if we participate in a political community of some sort is clearly Aristotle's idea, and it also reflects this idea of interdependence between the individual and the community. It's clear, by the way, that Aristotle doesn't mean that we need the state just so that we can eat, just so that our material needs are met. He actually clearly specifies that he doesn't just mean that. The state exists not just to provide the material needs, but to provide the kinds of affordances, one might say, the kinds of support that are needed to enable humans to develop their virtue, which for Aristotle, of course, is essentially happiness, the active life in accordance with virtue. I must say again, Aristotle is no democrat. Aristotle argues, of course, in Politics 1 for natural slavery. Aristotle has a blinkered and prejudiced view of what human nature actually is and what it can achieve. But if we abstract from that and look at the basic framework of his attitude, I think we get something that is both quite suggestive and also in keeping with the general tenor of political thought of the 5th and 4th centuries. So in sum, what I would say, drawing this comparison to a conclusion, is that the modern discourse of liberty, which we find in authors like Isaiah Berlin, Mill, Benjamin Constant, who wrote a lot about the French Revolution. The modern discourse of liberty is based on the idea of opposition and potential conflict between the state and the individual, whereas the ancient sources, particularly democratic sources, tend to emphasize the interdependence and compatibility of the individual and society. And I think it's quite fruitful to consider how this can perhaps help us get beyond traditional polarities, traditional binaries like the opposition between liberalism with its focus on human rights, individual rights, on the one hand, and communitarianism, the idea that the state takes precedence over the individual. And of course, tremendous amount of debate for obvious reasons in the 20th century in political theory was about that kind of dispute. But the ancients, as so often, I think, give us other ways of approaching these questions. And I would just say to also, especially the students who are beginning the exploration of ancient political theory, it's a tremendously exciting field, I think, precisely because of these differences to modern ways of approaching these questions. So that's what I wanted to say about liberty, that key democratic value. And I have just a few minutes I'll take to talk about the third notion that I want to focus on, which is expertise. Now, of course, expertise is one translation of the Greek word techne, which Anna very kindly mentioned is one of the core concepts that I'm interested in. And I've investigated the concept of techne in medical writers. What does it actually mean to have expertise? We can translate techne as expertise. Sometimes we translate it as art, sometimes as science. It's a very broad kind of term. But what I'm thinking about here is the place of this in society. How does a democratic society make use of specialized expertise? Obviously, the ancient Athenians had to have ways of making use of specialized expertise, despite their assumption of absolute equality of competence on political matters. So democracy assumes that everybody is qualified to make political judgments. The Athenian Democrats certainly assumed that. But some people have more competence than others in certain domains of knowledge. Doctors know more about making you better than other people, it is to be hoped, even in that period. Shipbuilders certainly know more and knew more than average people about how to build a ship. Construction workers knew how to build the Parthenon. The Athenians built the Parthenon. That involved organizing quite a bit of specialized knowledge to common ends. And so the question is, how do we integrate specialized knowledge into a political system that is committed to equality in a certain sense, equality of competence? And I think the goal should be to avoid technocracy. So a nice derivative of techne. Technocracy, which is ruled by a small number of specialized experts. We think of Plato and the Republic. Plato loves this idea. This was his conception of the right way to rule a state. Make sure that only a very small number or one person was in charge, and that they had the ultimate techne, the ultimate mastery of good and bad, that they could then implement in the political system. But we want to avoid technocracy. We also want to avoid what we can call idiocracy. I say that drawing on the classical sense of the word idiotes, which means a layperson, a non-specialist. That is to say, a kind of rule that pays no attention to specialized expertise, simply ignores it or assumes that nobody knows better on any question. And this is something that one finds in American society to some extent at the moment. I mean, the idea that there aren't any experts. Everybody is an expert. Everybody is qualified to comment or decide on everything. And this is not, I think, a productive course for a democracy to take. And the Athenians didn't take that course. They found ways to incorporate respect for expertise into their decision-making procedures. And this is something I think we can potentially learn from. So I'll just give one example of this. It's a very complicated issue, but one example, which is well known, is a passage of Plato's Protagoras, where Socrates is speaking. This is Plato's Protagoras, page 319. And in this passage, Socrates says that the Athenians, in fact, respect experts in their decision-making. When they're in the assembly and they listen to experts, they assess them on their qualifications and follow their advice. But when it comes to general questions, questions of politics, questions of what the city should do in general, everybody is qualified to speak. So they draw a sharp division between specialized areas where you should respect experts and political questions where everybody is qualified. And crucially, though, even the assessment of experts in this idealized model that Socrates is describing, even the assessment of experts is subject to public approval. So the public assesses, the various experts who come in and say how to build the wall or how to build the ships, how much will it cost, what materials will we need, and they assess the experts on the basis of their qualifications and make a decision. But when it comes to the question of should we build ships, should we build a wall, should we desert the city to repel the Persian invasion, there it's a question of politics and a question where everybody has a right to decide. So this is the picture that we get from this rather famous passage of the Protagoras. And it's obviously an idealized, quite artificial picture, not to say ironic. The passage begins with Socrates saying, I believe that the Athenians are wise, sophoi. I don't think we really believe that, but anyway, we don't believe that Socrates believed that, or we don't believe that Plato believed that Socrates believed that. Anyway, it's a complicated passage. But despite the idealization of the picture, it's still, I think, a useful insight. The idea that expertise should be respected, should not be ignored, but it needs some sort of public legitimation. If you're going to follow the advice of experts, it is wise to incorporate public approval into the process. And it prompts the question whether we could find ways to involve the public more in decision-making that involves experts. Obviously, issues like mask mandates, vaccine mandates have been much discussed. There is great skepticism and hostility to these kinds of measures, which people who are of a certain cast of mind see as simple applications of scientific results to the public good. And they are that, or they are efforts to apply science in that way. But perhaps the hostility to those things would be less if we could find some way to incorporate a public component in making the decisions. If somehow ordinary citizens were involved in deciding whether to impose mass mandates, they could at least legitimate the decision and lessen the hostility to applying expert opinion in the public sphere. And so I don't have an answer to suggest to that question. It's just a thought that perhaps we need, along the Athenian model, more public involvement, even when experts, technocrats in whatever domain are being brought into the discussion of political questions. So those are all the remarks that I wanted to make, and I'll stop now and be delighted to talk about any of these points, take your questions and comments. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I think you were crystal clear, and I think even the high school students who were attending got all your points. So I think I would like to ask people to start thinking about their questions, and I would like to ask a question to start the conversation. You devoted a lot of time on the 4 features of liberty. So I was wondering, which of your four features on liberty are the hardest to attain today? I think you touched upon it, but if you want to share an opinion.
Right. No, thanks. Yeah, that's a great thing to get us started. I mean, obviously, we don't live in slave societies, I think, hopefully, and we don't live under tyrannies. I mean, the question of, I think it's really a question of two and three there that are the real issues for it. I mean, do we want to live under a tyranny or not? That's a live issue, as we saw from the New York Times. And in the struggle against invasion in Ukraine, but also the idea of political participation. I think that's a huge challenge, especially in the United States. And I don't know the situation in Greece, but getting people to buy in to the political system is something that, I mean, clearly we need more of if decisions are going to be accepted as legitimate. And if the entire country voted to ban abortion, then that's something that the entire country might do. But there would at least be some basis. I mean, I'm not to take that one thing in particular, but the idea of having, certain bodies which are very small and unelected, making decisions for everybody is a problem. So I think that, they're intertwined, right? If we want to oppose autocracy, if we want to oppose tyranny, we need more participation. We need ways to encourage it, and we need people to buy into it. So I would see those as the two key challenges, really. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we have questions. So the question, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the very relevant and stimulating talk. I'm not sure I have a question, maybe comment or comments. One is, it may be a relevant idea to incorporate in the definition of democracy and democrats obedience to law, because laws are extremely important in the way obedience to law were very important to people who talk about the nature of Athenian democracy. The other thing is about liberty. For many, when Athenian speaks about liberty, they often refer to the Persian War and how they saw it. Liberty maybe should include also independence from foreign powers.
Right.
The other thing is that doing as you like is actually a bad thing in forensic oratory. People say on others that they try to do try to live as they please, and they mean that they try to live above the law or in ignorance of the law. So I'm not sure if Aristotle was not trying to be subversive there. And the last point about expertise, I think you're absolutely correct, with maybe the exception of political expertise and legal experts. There was actually quite hostility towards people like that because they were considered to have more power than they deserve, and actually unfair. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much for those comments. Could I just say one thing just in response? On that last point, I mean, the question of experts, I didn't mention, but there's this important book by Paulin Ismard about how the public slaves in Athens also provided a lot of expertise to the society. And that's something that needs to be taken into account, because it almost seems like, in a way, Athens could only tolerate expertise by saying that if you were an expert, you were not part of the political community. So, I mean, there is a sort of underlying hostility to expertise that one finds, I think, in Athens, such as what you mentioned, Joseph. And yes, liberty can have an external dimension as well as internal. So one can say, one is free because one is not dominated by external powers. And of course, that would apply to Sparta and all the Greek states that resisted the Persian invasion. I mean, that also is not distinctive of democracy, but an important component of the picture. And yes, obedience to law is indeed important. I mean, Pericles mentions that in the funeral oration. And we also get that in the speech of Demaratus to Xerxes, right, in Herodotus, that the Spartans are free precisely because they have law as their master. And that's a very interesting connection. Anyway, thanks for those points. And I'll have to look more at the living as you like in the orators, because of the hostility to that is, as you say, not limited to Plato. Good. Okay. So others, yes.
Yes, Don, please go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much, Mark. This has been very, even in such a short canvas, has been very provocative and illuminating for me. I have just a quick endorsing comment and then a question. The endorsing comment is that the talk you gave has been very helpful in sort of helping me put my finger on something which has bugged me for a while. And especially in your remarks on sort of expertise versus, expertise about techne versus a more general sort of knowledge about action or about political virtue. And the thing that had bugged me was this kind of thing, I'm not sure if other people have seen it, where you see votive candles. Votive candles usually will have an imprint of a saint, someone remarkable for their lives or their martyrdom in some way. But some thing that has popped up under the recent couple of years would be a votive candle with the image of Dr. Anthony Fauci, for instance. And that sort of bugged me, well, you might think votive candles are for, as it were, the morally virtuous, or the phronomoi with respect to a broader set of concerns. But then you have a votive candle where there's, an expert epidemiologist. And I never was able to sort of figure out, well, why did that really bug me to see Dr. Fauci on a votive candle? And I think the distinctions that you were drawing helped me to at least begin to think through some of that, sort of what bugged me about that. The second thing I want to say real quickly is a question about similar to what has been raised recently about living as you please or living as you like. And I wonder, I wonder if this fits into the third. Sorry, if this fits into, I think you brought up two different ways of sort of reconciling the third and fourth planks of liberty. And I wonder, the thing I want to put on the table and just to ask whether it might matter, might help or in some way, is to put the idea of the spudaios, the serious person, a serious man, on the table here, where the contrast often in Aristotle between the person, the libertine, the person who lives as they pleases, is the serious person. And democracy is bad in some senses because it gives rule to the unserious. And I'm wondering if you could say more about sort of the difference between living as you like and living with some seriousness. And just a quick follow-up about that is some of the teaching fellows from the NAFPLIO high school summer program may have heard some of this. Here's an instance, I think, of the unserious person in the airport yesterday in Athens. People are crowding around in line, and there's one person who cut in front of everyone and said, "I know this is unfair. You can call me a bad person if you like, but I need to get on the plane. I'm going to cut the line. No matter what you say, I just don't care." So there's one example that I think some of the teaching fellows might resonate with.
That was the airport in Athens?
That's right, yes, just yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, that's an example of somebody who just wants to do what they want, right? And has no attention to, the impact on others. And yes, I mean, this idea of the spudaios versus just what you want. I mean, I think of the passage in Plato's Gorgias, where Polus says that tyrants do as they please. And Socrates attacks that by saying, no, they do what seems best to them. They don't do what they really want. So, and it's bouletai, which is the word that is used here in this living as you like. And the idea that there is, people should be living in ways that what they really want is actualized. That is to say, if you're a Platonist and certainly an Aristotelian, what you really want is the good life, the active life in accordance with virtue. So I think, if I were to make a distinction, the spoudios is somebody who is attentive to those facts, right? Attentive to the idea that what he really likes is the good life according to virtue. That's what he really wants, and that's the way that he will act. And so in a way, my two ways of reconciling 3 and 4 are, I think, depending on different ways of reading that want, right? If you read want as just any old desire that comes your way, then you get something like the libertine example. But if you read want as what you really want, that is to say, activity in accordance with virtue, then I think you get the more positive conception of this interdependence. But anyway, I take your point that this notion of the spoudios is relevant to that. And I don't really have anything to say about Dr. Fauci on the vote of candles, except that I think of the movie, if anyone saw the second Borat movie, where Dr. Fauci is attacked at the end, a stuffed, huge Dr. Fauci is attacked by a crowd at the end. It's sort of the flip side to your example. The hostility of the idea that somebody who is a scientist is I guess, making political decisions is there encapsulated. And I take it from your examples that this is approval that somebody who is a scientist is also, there to, structure our approach. So, there are different reactions that you get. So anyway, thanks for that beautiful example.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I'm writing currently my thesis about democracy in ancient Athens, and it's about the 4th century. And the question is simply to say it, if we can still speak about a democracy, because we have, especially in the second half of the 4th century, financial experts that actually are necessary because the circumstances have changed, and these experts they rule, and the people in the assembly they have to trust them, because the experts still have to act for the benefit of the demos, but they rule, and the people can't follow the complicated discussions that are happening in the assembly. So the question is, if you have those experts that are ruling, of course they're ruling for the benefaction of the demos, but they are ruling. Can we still speak about democracy, about the rule of the demos? Or would you try to find another term to describe the events?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, this institution of the financial supremo, as Paul Cartledge calls him in his book on democracy, the financial supremo who comes in the 4th century with expertise in management of accounts and so forth, and is not excluded from the political community. This is not slave matter, but yes, I think that office is part of the larger story of the history of expertise within the Athenian democracy. I would not see the institution of that particular office as undermining the fundamentally democratic character of things. It's more a problem. It's a case where there was a problem of reconciling democracy with specialized expertise, and it was a new solution that the Athenians found, and that would have to be part of a deeper story of the history of expertise in democracy. But I would not see it as undermining the fundamentally democratic character the Constitution. I would see it as a place where there is a certain amount of tension. And it's interesting to look at the way the Athenians respond to that tension and the needs that prompt them to create that particular office. But basically, no, I don't think that we need to find a different term for the system just because that one office comes into being at that time. But I'd be happy to correspond about your research on that topic. I think it's a very interesting example.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. The Athenian democracy, I think, was a polarized constitution. Athenian democracy was, in fact, the constitution which safeguarded the interests of the demos, the majority, against the few, the nobles. Do you think that populism, as the justification of the demands of the majority, is an inherent element in ancient direct democracy and in modern republics in a certain way?
Right. Well, I mean, that, of course, was one understanding of ancient democracy, that the demos was ruling in its own interest. And that is the view that you get very clearly in the work on the Constitution of the Athenians that is attributed to Xenophon, so the so-called old oligarch. It could certainly be that. It was clear that at times it was that. I think the challenge for Athenian democracy was, as always, to avoid that and to have the demos really mean everyone, right? I mean, the demos is everybody in the political community, not just the lower classes. So, Aristotle, of course, is quite clear that it's often also the case that what we have is the demos ruling in its own interest. It becomes factional. That's why he doesn't like democracy. He thinks that the good for an individual group or individual class. So I think that actually the ancient texts perhaps provide us with ways to combat that kind of factionalism. I'm not sure I would call it populism because I kind of like the idea of populism. The idea that the people decide is, of course, what democracies are supposed to be all about. But when you have decisions being made in the interests of particular factions rather than in the common interest, it becomes destabilizing. So anyway, I think that there's a positive way of looking at ancient democracy, which is everybody is involved in this collaborative project of self-government. There's also the factional way of looking at it, which, let's be honest, presumably did improve the lot of the lower classes to some extent, but was also destabilizing and ultimately not, I think, successful. But I don't think that anybody could say that Greek democracy failed purely because of factionalism. I mean, it was the Macedonian conquest that really put an end to the Athenian democratic experiment. So anyway, important point about populism, but that's some thoughts on that. Thank you for raising the issue.
Thank you. I don't know. Okay, so
hello, Anna. I'm sorry I cannot switch on my camera because greetings from Nafplio, but my internet is not very stable. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Please go ahead. And
okay. Hi. Thank you very much for a brilliant talk. I did write a little question in the chat, and this involved. My question has to do with your very intriguing connection between arts and sciences through technique, and you're hinting at their involvement in the notion of politics, but I think you mostly looked at their the notion of technique's expertise as being a sort of entitlement in decision making, which is part or main part of politics. Would you see in technique as both arts and sciences a kind of political function per se that is not as a way of facilitating politics, but as a way of doing politics as such?
Well, thank you. Certainly the idea that there is a politicae techne So a techne of politics, an art of politics, is one that is much discussed. Sorry, were you saying something else? Oh, maybe missed something. But the idea of a political art or a political science is something that's much discussed in the texts of that period. And that, of course, is what is actually under dispute in the passage of the Protagoras that I mentioned. It's a question of what that expertise really is. And the democratic way of saying that politics is an art is the perspective that Protagoras, the speaker, actually gives in his story, which is that yes, it is an art, but everybody is an expert. All the Athenians are experts in politics. There is something that you need to know. After all, being a citizen of a polis is different from living out in the wild and not associating with anybody. So there is something. It goes back to eidos and dike. It goes back to respect for justice and reverence, and you build on that to build a community that respects law and justice. So the idea that there should be some kind of art to political decision making can be found in both democratic forms, that's the Protagorean model, but also non-democratic forms, which the Platonic model, that this involves ultimate understanding of Platonic forms and is imposed by the few on the many. So I think it's a productive idea that techne can be part of politics, although I think that when we're talking about recognized professions like shipbuilding, construction, medicine, the overlap is potentially less there. But it's worth thinking about whether the concept of techne itself has a political dimension. This is certainly something that is worth considering in these debates.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Angeliki. We have 5 more minutes, and I would like to ask the person in the room at the CHS to ask their question now. Please go ahead. I hope it's one question.
Anna, thank you. Actually, we are 2 persons. We're going to combine it, but we're going to be. Oh, can you hear us?
Yes,
yes.
We can.
We're actually 2. And we're going to ask it very quickly for the sake of time. So first of all, I want to second my colleague Don, and so thank Mark for an all-encompassing talk, which is going to be the best introduction possible for the high school program that starts tomorrow with Plato, the Republic, and expertise in democracy. I want to ask 2 quick questions about issues that are present in political theory today, about things that we can use from antiquity perhaps. One is sortition, the idea of allocating offices by lot. Is it a good idea? Is it something that would help in terms of political participation and equality? And the second is referenda as a form of direct democracy that's becoming easier and easier to do today. Is it something that would help participation or not? And then my colleague Nicoletta has a question too.
Thank you, Nicholas. Dear Mark, congratulations for your great lecture. I would like to ask your opinion about today. Do you believe that the participation, the huge participation in social media of most of us may affect our need, the searching of more freedom in the political and public sphere? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite see. So, could you just say it again? That the use of social media may
the use of social media can reduce our need to participate in to wish for freedom in the public sphere, in the political sphere, in the political level.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Thank you.
In other words, so basically the 2 questions are connected with participation, and your question is potentially social media something that reduces the need to actually participate politically because it gives us a way to vent our opinion, if I understand your question. So we don't need to participate because we have the outlet of social media. And then Nicholas asked about the two practices of sortition and referenda. It's interesting about sortition. It's not entirely clear what the motivation of sortition was in the distribution of offices in Athens. Of course, you can see it as an expression of equality, right? Everybody is equally capable, at least offices where you don't require specialized knowledge. But another way of looking at it is that it's a good way to avoid corruption. And I tend to think that all the debates that we have about elections being corrupt, being not corrupt, one of the reasons why the Athenians adopted sortition, I think, is that the practice was less liable to corruption. I mean, just look at Roman ambitus and all that stuff, electoral corruption that Cicero talks about and that Cicero used, right, to get elected and so forth. So, you know, sortition is, I think, a very valuable thing to think about. Referenda, I have, you know, it seems to me that this is basically a good idea to build in some sort of direct democratic component. And you do see in the American states, of course, varieties of this. California is actually particularly liable to referenda and constitutional amendment. And one could study really how well those work. I mean, normally people talk about Brexit as a negative example because, of course, normally, I mean, the majority opinion of people involved in discussions like this tends to be against Brexit, I think, but not everybody is of that view. And I think that more study of the way in which referenda work would definitely be worthwhile because it gives people a way to buy in. I mean, if there could be referenda on whether to have mask mandates in your community, I think, you know, a lot of people in America would say, yeah, follow the science. I mean, if you present, you know, the science clearly to people and, you know, they have a power of decision. So I think that, you know, that's a possible way forward. And yeah, I think, you know, social media has many dangerous and possibly destabilizing potentials about it. And one of them could be that, you know, one is less eager to participate in the political project. I mean, I don't know how we combat that. Except I think by, again, you know, stressing the importance of participation, so that you feel that you're part of the government, and you know, it is the government of the people, yeah. So anyway, it's an interesting thought because often one thinks of social media as being, you know, potentially, you know, beneficial in allowing people to express opinions, debate, discuss, but in general, it isn't like that. And we have to think about, I think, in terms of liberty, right? Should there be limits on social media? And if so, what should they be? That's, I think, still a very open question. And there's no good answer to that. But I think it's something that, again, the ancient Athenian experience may shed light on. I mean, they had paresia, of course. Freedom of speech was very important, but it had its limits in certain socially regulated ways. And, you know, looking at that might shed some light on the contemporary problem. So anyway, I don't have a good answer to that, but those are some thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. We've had a 25-minute discussion, a very lively discussion. So I was wondering, Mark, would you like to make a final comment before we say goodbye to our audience and before we close this year's event series? Do you have a last?
Well, I would only thank everybody for their attendance and also for the very stimulating comments and questions. And you know, it was a pleasure to participate and see so much interest in these very important topics. So, you know, our mission at the center remains as it was at its inception, which is to foster critical dialogue and discourse about legacy of ancient Greek and indeed contemporary Greek society for our political problems. So that's what I tried to do in this paper, and I was really delighted to have so many excellent responses and questions. So I appreciate it very much, and thank you to Evan and to Anna and the whole team for putting on this series, and we will indeed continue in a similar vein, I think, in the future. So stay tuned for further developments, and please feel free to be in touch if you have further thoughts about the things I was talking about. I'd be very grateful.
We'll share the comments with you, Mark, because there are some comments that we were not able to read. But I would just like to say that this year's cycle of the event series, entitled as Public Discourse in Times of Crisis, is today complete. We had 4 events this year, and you can find the recordings from all the events of this year and from previous years on the CHS Greece YouTube channel. And we would like to thank everyone who has contributed to the event series 2022, the speakers in particular, and the collaborating institutions. So thank you very much, and see you next year all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.